Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this IOE professorial lecture given by Professor Martin Mills on the subject of teachers and teaching, the politics of respect. My name is Professor Sue Rogers, Interim Director of the UCL Institute of Education, and I'm delighted to be chairing this evening. Ordinarily, I would start these events with the usual note about what to do if the fire alarm sounds. Clearly, that's not needed today as we continue to meet virtually due to the COVID-19 public health measures. I do still have one housekeeping matter to cover though, and that's to say, if you'd like to tweet about the lecture, the Twitter hashtag is #IOE lectures, and please do join in. But let me get the proceedings properly underway by introducing our speaker tonight, Professor Martin Mills. Martin joined the IOE in 2017 as Professor of Education and our inaugural Director of our Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research, or CTTR as it is known. We identified this area as a significant gap in education research internationally and wanted to be at the heart of reinvigorating scholarship on teachers and their work, in partnership, importantly, with the teaching profession. Reflecting and reaffirming that impetus, we were lucky enough to be able to tempt Martin all the way over from Australia to establish CTTR for us. Martin himself served as a teacher, a high school teacher of English history, before taking up a highly esteemed career in academia. His research has spanned pedagogy, school reform, alternative education and gender, as well as teachers' work and teacher education, in each case underpinned by a strong commitment to social justice. His most recent books include Reimagining Schooling for Education and Re-engaging Young People in Education, Learning from Alternative Schools. Our focus this evening is the subject of respect for teachers. And it seems even more timely to think about this now, as all of us are aware of the ways in which public policies in response to COVID-19 have raised additional challenging issues in this regard. Martin's lecture focuses our attention on some fundamental questions that education systems will need to address if they are to truly reinvigorate teacher morale and retention. And with that, I invite Martin to present his lecture. Martin, over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Sue. So this is the third time I've been going to give this lecture. The first time it was in February and we had industrial action. The second time was in March, just prior to us going into lockdown. So this is our third attempt to give the lecture. I do want to thank Kate and Matt for the work they've been doing in helping me get prepared for this lecture, and Ching and Sue for chairing and for responding to the lecture. There was an opportunity to either use slides and have my disembodied voice behind them, or to see me and no slides. I've gone for no slides and me. However, I do have a couple of slides during the course of the lecture that I would like to use. And one at the beginning, just to give you an indication of where the lecture's going, a bit of a roadmap. So you can follow that as we proceed through the lecture. So I'll just show you that slide. start preparing these lectures, I'm always terrified that I won't have enough to say, and then in the end I prepare far too much. So I'm hoping that I haven't done too long a presentation, but I will keep it to my somewhere between 45 and 50 minutes. So before I introduce the lecture, I want to make a statement, really, and I've thought about an appropriate way in which to do this, and it feels for me, in terms of presenting this lecture, that it's impossible to ignore what's happening in relation to Black Lives Matter and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority ethnic communities. Had I been giving this lecture in Australia, I would have begun with an acknowledgement of country and of the traditional owners of the land in which we were meeting. I'd have paid my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I would have recognised that the land had never been ceded. So in doing that, in thinking about this lecture, I thought I wanted to draw some, make some comment about Australia. I travelled from England to Australia as a young teenager on a boat and did most of my high school and university studies there. My family moved to Australia with the intent of looking for opportunities that didn't appear to exist for us in England at the time. Privileges and opportunities have come my way as a result of that move to Australia, but they come at a cost, and come at a cost for Indigenous people. I could talk at length about the statistics involving Indigenous people in Australia, but I just, especially given the Black Lives Matter protests at the moment, will focus on the justice system. Indigenous people in Australia only make up 3% of the population, but 28.6% of the prison population. Indigenous juveniles are 26 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous Australians. And the fastest growing prison population in Australia is Indigenous women. Black deaths in custody has been a significant issue in Australian politics for many, many years. In 1991, there was a Royal Commission into Black deaths in custody with 339 recommendations, many of which have not been taken up. Since that time, there have been another 437 deaths in custody. There's not been one criminal conviction, despite evidence of, in a state and in an area where I was doing research in a school and have written quite a lot about that school. There was a brutal death of an Indigenous man, and no criminal conviction was in custody and was recorded. On a boat, also on a boat from England 250 years ago, this year, Cook arrived in Australia, James Cook, in what later became known as Botany Bay. One of the very first acts on arrival was to shoot an Aboriginal man, Cooman. The shield through which that bullet passed, the Guigal shield, is held not 250 metres from where I work in the British Museum, despite requests over and over again from his family for the return of that shield. So along with many other Indigenous artefacts, they remain in the British Museum. So I raise this at the beginning of the talk because I want to make clear that racism and white privilege are global discourses, all with local inflections. I want to draw connections between the first gunshots ever heard on the continent of Australia, to the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, and to my positioning now in Australia, in England, sorry, in London, and that there is making that connection between the racism that exists here and also exists in Australia. And for me, it's never okay to be silent on these issues. And so I wanted to use this opportunity to make that statement. I also raise it because throughout my talk, social justice will be ever present. I don't touch on issues of race and ethnicity in the talk, but they're never far from the surface. And I do intend to come back to activism at the end of the talk, to circle back. So the introduction to my talk. This talk, I've been thinking about respect for quite some time. I've interviewed lots of young people in schools, kids who've been excluded from school, potentially being excluded. I've interviewed their teachers. I've interviewed teachers around a range of issues. And the word respect has often come up. And I thought for a long time that I'd wanted to try and write something or do something on respect. And it sort of drifted into the back of my mind, knowing it was there, but I hadn't as yet addressed it. And then last year I went to a talk or an event with Jeremy Hodge and Becky Taylor, Antonina Tereshchenko and Becky Francis on their grouping study. And on the way back from that talk, I was catching an underground train home. And I don't know if you know those moments when you go to you wait for an underground to come, it finally comes, the doors open, and there's just you can't really get on the train. And I was at that moment waiting to leap onto this train, and I deciding whether to do it or not. And a young man was standing there in the doors, and he kind of gave me these sort of eye movements. Come on, you can do it, you can do it. So I jumped, and he kind of pulled me in. And as a consequence, we started chatting about where I'd been that evening and what he was doing. And then he said, "Oh, were you a teacher? Are you a teacher?" And I said, "Oh, no, I used to be an English and history teacher." And he said to me, "Thank you for your service." And I was kind of a bit sort of strange, it was a strange sensation. It's sort of something I associate with, National Health Service or sometimes in America talking to people who are in the armed forces. I'd never experienced that before. Anyway, we had a long kind of chat on the tube. And as he's getting out, he sort of looked at me and goes, teacher. And then he put his hand up, and I don't know if you can see it, but he put his hand up and he kind of gave me this sort of fist pump and went, "Respect." And at that point, I thought, and I sat on the tube for some time afterwards, thought I really want to do something with this respect and this notion of respect. And so I went to, I started thinking about it, and it's become the basis of this lecture. What was interesting for me in that respect comment from him is he knew nothing about me, whether I was a great teacher, terrible teacher, how I treated young people or anything. It was as a group. He was thinking of teachers as a group and a respect for them as a group. And I think that raises really interesting issues about the nature of teaching and about how we respect teachers. As a consequence, I bought this book when I was Richard Sennett's 2003, I think you can see it, Respect in a World of Inequality. And I did dabble in with it every so often, including about 30 minutes ago, and always find something new in it. And trying to work my way through understanding what might be meant by respect. There's kind of two ways in which you can think of respect. And I also engage with some of the management literature on this. And there's a nice paper by Rogers and Ashforth in the Journal of Management, where they talk about respect in organizations. And they talk about two different kinds of respect: individual or particularized respect. So the respect that you might feel as an individual in terms of how you're treated by your colleagues, how you're treated by your bosses, and so forth. But there's also a professional or generalized respect, how you might be respected as a result of the job or the occupation you have. And I think that's the kind of respect that I was trying to get my head around. And Richard Sennett's book tries to unpack this notion. It's a sort of strange concept, he says, and I kind of feel that in many ways when I was trying to prepare this lecture. So Richard Sennett says, look, it's not status. It's a bit like status. It's like prestige, but it's not prestige. It could be honor or dignity. They're words that approximate respect, but they don't quite capture it. And indeed, to some extent, disrespect or a lack of respect is far more obvious. And he says in the book, and I've got a few quotes, and I'll read them out. So he says, look, lack of respect, though less aggressive than an outright insult, can take an equally wounding form. No insult is offered another person, but neither is recognition extended. He or she is not seen as a full human being whose presence matters. And I think to some extent that applies to the teaching workforce in the ways in which decisions are made about them, for them, without including them, as if their presence doesn't matter in the decision-making process. And to me, that's a part of the disrespect that's shown to the teaching profession. Now, why should we be concerned about respect in the teaching profession? I think there's multiple reasons, but three clear ones are, and I've used this analogy before, and this might be the very last time I use it. But the teachers' well-being and how teachers feel they are treated has an impact upon young people. The analogy I've used in the past is that when we used to do air travel, but when you're on a plane and they're going through the safety precautions with you and the safety, stuff you have to do, and they say, if we need oxygen and the oxygen drops, put it on yourself first. And the kind of implication is you can't help anybody else until you're taken care of. And I think if we want to ensure that young people get the best education possible, we have to take care of teachers. We have to make sure that they've got the oxygen to be able to work within their profession in productive ways. I think secondly, social justice is integral to how teachers come to see themselves and to how they are within the workplace. And that's absolutely tied to respect. There's very real impacts of being a disrespected profession, I think, and material consequences. And Sue mentioned it in the introduction about teacher retention. And I think that part of the disrespect teachers feel in the workplace, not necessarily from any individual, not necessarily from within the administrative parts of the school, but from an overall way in which they are seen within policy and treated within policy, can have real impacts. A week in 2018, I just thought I'd gather a week in 2018, look to see what the headlines said about teachers, and nearly everything came. This is when I'd first arrived at the Institute, to see what was being said in the British media about teachers and the workforce, and everything was about teacher retention. These are headings from newspapers, all in 1 week. Vast majority of teachers considered quitting in past year poll. That was in The Guardian. Recruitment crisis means teaching without teachers will become a necessity. That was in TES. Angela Rayner, former Shadow Education Secretary, warns of crisis in teaching profession. That was in TES as well. Teachers' talent and commitment wasted on industrial scale with job undoable. And then another article about the increase in call for teachers seeking emotional support. A health and well-being charity for education staff has reported a 35% increase in calls from teachers to an emotional support helpline over the past 12 months. So newspapers picking up on this teacher retention issue. That was in 2018, and it's continued into 2019. 4 out of 10 teachers plan to quit, survey suggests, BBC. Worst school staffing crisis in decades as new teachers quit in record numbers. That was August 2019 in the Mirror. Then again in the Mirror, teachers set for the biggest pay rise since 2005 to stop staff quitting profession. I don't know what happened to that pay rise, but that was in January of this year. Then the NFER put out a report pre-COVID, before the lockdown, on NFER Teacher Labour Market in England, Annual Report 2020. In this report, secondary teacher training, and I would love us to retire that word training. I would use secondary teacher education entry. remains below target. Recruitment in shortage subjects is below target. Fewer newly qualified teachers being retained into their second year. 1 in 7 don't make it into the second year of teaching. And the DFE stats also indicate that a third, right, third of teachers, newly qualified teachers, don't get past 5 years. That's huge attrition. Language teachers, shortage of supply, definitely been increased. The shortage has been exacerbated, this report indicates, by the Brexit referendum. So there's an issue, all pre-COVID, to issues around teacher shortages, trying to get enough people into teacher education being a real issue. There has been some change since the rise of COVID-19. An EPI study, Education Policy Institute study, released in June 2020, looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the attraction and retention of teachers. And they mentioned in their report that we expect roughly 1,800 more graduates to go into teacher training, they use it to, teacher training programs over the next 2 years, which would reduce recruitment shortages between 20 and 40%. So some joy there. And they also indicate thousands of teachers are likely to remain in the profession when then they would have otherwise quit. Now that all seems positive and is positive, but will they stay? What does it mean about teachers who are saying, well, there's nothing else out there for me, I'll become a teacher because it's a secure job and there'll always be jobs for teachers? Now, some of those people obviously will make fantastic teachers, but for some people it is just a placeholder while they wait to move to their next position. So will they stay? Is that sufficient? I think we can't suggest that just because of COVID-19 we can celebrate increases in the retention and attraction of teachers. We have to do something else. With my colleagues in the CTTR, the Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research, we started a project last year talking to senior leadership teams in London in schools that were designated as kind of high poverty areas to try and find out what they were doing about trying to retain teachers and trying to attract teachers into their schools. Some of the comments that were being made to us about the current environment, of which again many of them saw was not of their making, was really concerning. So one teacher, Ellen, pseudonyms obviously, of Ellen, a head teacher of Cliffside School, primary school, said, I think it's a toxic context we work in at the moment. If I was at a different age and point in my life, I would leave too. The amount of bureaucracy is ridiculous and you can't not do it. I can't ask people not to do it. Now, I'm not, I don't do conversation analysis, but I've worked closely with people who've had. And if you see a sentence like, I think it's a toxic, used twice, quite emphatically, that there is something going on here in that environment that is a real concern about how you would keep teachers in those environments. Now, at the same moment that we were doing that project, the government, the DFE, released its teacher recruitment and retention strategy in 2019. And if you look at that strategy, there's lots to like about it. So it talks about 4 kind of arms to its strategy: creating a more supportive school cultures and reduced workload, transforming support for early career teachers, making sure teaching remains an active career as lifestyles and aspirations change, and making it easier for great people to become teachers. I've always thought it should be making it easier for people to become great teachers rather than great people teachers, but that's by the by, I guess. So within those 4 elements, again, some quite positive things are said. So to reduce excessive workload, they will help create the right climate with head teachers and other school leaders to establish supportive school cultures At the heart of it, they'll reform the accountability system. For early career teachers, we will transform support for early career teachers, introducing the most significant reforms to teaching since it became a graduate-only profession, backed by a substantial extra investment. And that's from which the early career framework has evolved. And Mark Hardman in our centre, with other peoples in the centre and elsewhere in the IOE, are currently doing an evaluation of aspects of that early career framework. Part of it is a 2-year support package for all new teachers with some reduced timetable and a dedicated mentor. So the third thing was to make it an attractive career, where they say they'll build on the foundations of the early career framework to support teachers, whatever their expertise or circumstances, to pursue the right career opportunities for them. And fourthly, they'll make it easier to become a teacher. Now, some concerns about making it easier to become a teacher, which might become evident as I talk further. But they say they will radically simplify the process to become a teacher, introducing new digital systems to make it easier and more user-friendly to apply to be a teacher. So all quite positive in many ways. We asked many of these senior leadership team head teachers what they thought of this policy at this moment. They tended to be very skeptical, I had to say. So we take the first strand, more supportive school cultures and reduced workload. Many felt that it was unlikely that the DfE would reduce accountability pressures. They also thought, for many of them, that teacher retention would become a new Ofsted inspection criteria, where they would be judged on the ways in which they'd managed to retain teachers. One head teacher from Woodside Secondary, Brian, again, all pseudonyms, makes the point, I don't think that Ofsted or the current performance tables will do anything to reduce accountability, and the culture, therefore, around that, because staff will always feel they have to, you know, if you're head of maths, head of English, your results are published. You see them on the league table. You know they're there. And that's more accountability than there was before, right? So not much expectation around more supportive school cultures and reduced workload. What about transforming support for early career teachers? Well, for many of those head teachers, they say that the workload reduction is always on the agenda for them. They're always trying to find funding and finding ways to support early career teachers. But one deputy head, Nathan at Edgewater Primary, made the point that the teacher recruitment and retention strategy is a PR exercise. I think there needs to be specific support for schools in where there are areas of high deprivation because of the challenges that those schools bring. You know, then he makes the point, putting a plaster on a gashing wound. I think it needs more than that. Again, you can sense the emotion and the frustration and the cynicism in many of these head teachers' language. So what about making sure teaching remains an attractive career as lifestyles and aspirations change? We had lots of talk, it was in London, about people moving out of London for families, and sometimes that caused problems and it caused high turnover. But they talked about that with current funding levels, there was very hard to create opportunities for teachers to be promoted or to retain them for special tasks. One head, Nancy, says, look, it's difficult because, you know, with budgets, you can't, whereas before you might have been able to say, we'll give you a post of responsibility. So it gives somebody a chance to, with some extra income, extra salary attached to it, to give them a post of responsibility to develop their CV and to enable them to stay at the school to develop both themselves and various programs within the school. And the last one, the fourth one, to make it easier for great people to become teachers. For many of these head teachers and deputy heads, they found the language here quite insulting and patronizing. one, Ellen, head at the Cliffside Primary, was particularly indignant. And she made the comment to us, in a normal 9-to-5 job, you wouldn't be expected to do that. I find this insulting, making it easier, as if we're not great. My biggest bugbear was that god-awful teach first. Why not teach last or teach always? Why are we a second-rate profession? Now, whatever you think of teach first, it's a bit in the name, teach first. The notion that teach first and then go on and do your real career, I think, is what upset Ellen. But the point is that the idea of making it easier and kind of being dismissive of existing teachers was the way in which this document was read. Now, it's worth having a look at the policy document and looking at some of the names of the people who've signed off on it. And some of those names are people who I have the highest admiration for in their support for teachers, the work they do with teachers, one of whom was recently on one of the IOE debates. And it's thinking, like, many of the people who are putting that together are really well-meaning. I don't think it's a sense in which of how can we get teachers, but somewhere there's a cynicism that's developed. And for me, to come back to my talk, it's about disrespect. It's the notion of the disrespected teacher. And that disrespect has bred a form of cynicism and a form of sense of people sensing that it's a toxic environment and that they wouldn't work in that environment if they didn't have to. So now I want to, for those of you who remember the outline, is to say something about the disrespected teacher and the teaching profession. There's a lovely paper by Raewyn Connell in Critical Studies in Education, Good Teachers on Dangerous Grounds Towards a New View of Teacher Quality and Professionalism. And in that paper, she outlines different ways in which the good teacher has been constructed over time, from an obedient servant who just does what the government tells them to do, a technical professional, somebody who is very technical at implementing what's expected, the scholar teacher, and I guess that's, the scholar teacher might be somebody that I would advocate, somebody who engages with deep thoughts about education, philosophy, sociology, psychology, etc. But she then argues that we've become now, it's more about the good teacher is the competent or auditable teacher, somebody who can be audited, who can be determined whether you are able to tick boxes to say whether they're meeting certain performance standards or certain criteria. And indeed, in virtually every location that I know, there's sets of teaching standards being developed. And that's the case obviously in England. And those teaching standards, and so, the ones in England, and had I been presenting this, I would have gone to the DfE website. The ones in England, when you first read them, they sound okay. Set high expectations which inspire, motivate and challenge pupils. Promote good progress and outcomes by pupils. Demonstrate good subject knowledge. Plan and teach well-structured lessons. Fulfill wider professional responsibilities. Make accurate and productive use of assessment. Manage behaviour. But when you start to really think about them, and this is Connell's point, and also in a lovely paper by Judith Sachs that I'll mention in a moment, they can be set up as tick boxes. I've set high expectations, tick. I've promoted good progress and outcomes by pupils, tick. So there's no kind of thought about the complexity of teachers' work. There's no it's kind of reductive and a complete absence of educational theory. Take two areas, for example. Demonstrate good subject and curriculum knowledge. If you think about education as a discipline, two things that are belong in education, and only really in education, is curriculum, understanding of curriculum. And yet, when you look at what the kind of finer points are of demonstrating good subject and curriculum knowledge, there's no understanding of curriculum theory. There's talks about literacy, teaching early reading and using synthetic phonics, teaching early mathematics. No engagement, no requirement that teachers engage with questions, and some questions which are really important questions around powerful knowledges, for instance, what knowledge should be in the curriculum? What's the best knowledge? If we provide knowledge that's so disconnected from people's worlds and yet holds cultural capital, should we be teaching that knowledge to young people who don't have access to cultural capital, or should we be trying to tap into their worlds? Key questions. None of that is part of this of these standards. It's all, as I say, tick box. The same with assessment. Assessment, again, is something peculiar to the discipline of education, and again, limited. Know and understand how to assess the relevant subject and curriculum areas. Make use of formative and summative assessment to secure pupils' progress. When you think about the depth of assessment and assessment literacy, really, that teachers need, none of that is mentioned here. I think of when I was a teacher, one of the things that was expected is that you would try to learn from your assessment. So when as a teacher, you would learn. So, if one student kind of doesn't understand a concept, well, maybe they've got a problem and you need to think about how you can work with that student. But if the whole class doesn't get the concept, well, you've got a problem and you've got to go think back about your pedagogy and so it's about an assessment for learning for the students, but an assessment for learning for the teachers. None of that complexity around assessment is here, all tick boxes. Again, I think that's hugely problematic. Now, Judith Sachs, in an excellent article in an excellent journal, Teachers and Teaching Theory and Practice, has an article called Teacher Professionalism. Why are we still talking about it? And she wants to argue that we need to be seen as teaching needs to be seen as a mature profession. And she goes on to argue that with the current focus on regulation and teacher standards, we actually don't provide an opportunity for teachers to engage in authentic professional learning, so that we need opportunities for teachers to think about their own learning, not being regulated. She also says that in the long term, that leads to a teaching profession that's timid in their judgments. And she goes on, and this is the reductive nature, whose skills are reduced and whose perception in the community is that of a technical worker. And I think that's what we need to move beyond if we want to think about a respected profession. And teacher professionalism, as she argues, is a contested site. What constitutes teacher professionalism? I remember one of the very first papers I ever wrote used Gerald Grace, who was at the IOE, notion of professionalism being a double-edged sword, in that it can be both used to control and an opportunity for people to be to exercise more discretion in their workplace. I think that what he said in 1980s or early 90s is as true today as it was then. I'm going to in a moment show a couple of slides, but I just want to make a couple of points, because I've mentioned accountability a couple of times, and it's easy to be typecast or to be suggesting that I'm saying that teachers shouldn't be accountable. I have no problem with accountability, right? But it's accountable for what and to whom. And I think we have to think about what is important in our jobs and who should we be accountable to, in the same way that any other profession. If somebody dies in an operating theatre, then the surgeons have to be held to account. If a lawyer does a terrible job in a court case and someone ends up getting life in prison, then they need to be, held accountable for not doing their job properly. But it's for what and to whom. And some of these accountabilities are hugely problematic, as I've said. The work of Pasi Sahlberg is lovely, and Pasi Sahlberg writes a lot, is from Finland, and writes a lot about the Finnish education system, was in the World Bank for a while and is now at the University of New South Wales. But he made this point about intelligent accountabilities and says, teachers belong to a community of high professionals, just as medical doctors and engineers, where trust in and among professionals is the prime code of work. Accountability policies should not jeopardize that trust and social capitals in schools, but should strengthen it. So accountability policies have to be about making sure that we can feel respected in the profession, that we can feel that, or that teachers can feel that they're trusted, and that they're trusted to do their job without constant interference. I did note, I think it was a couple of days ago, that Gavin Williamson was making some comment about how teachers needed to get students facing the front, and that's the best way they learn. Like, again, this to me is so disrespectful of teachers. What's Gavin's background in education, and what makes him think that that's the best way of learning? But I think the disrespect is we in the field of education can be complicit in it. In a second, I'm about to show you 2 slides. You get a brief break from seeing me. The slides were given to me by a very, very close family member who said I wasn't to mention her name, and she's been through them to make sure that the schools are completely anonymized. And just to show how sometimes these matrices and these accountability processes can play themselves out in such disrespectful ways. So Matt, if you could just put the first slide up briefly. And so this slide, can you see that now? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Matt. So this is a slide from a school, and it's staff expectations. Down one side, you probably can't read it all at the moment. Down one side is this slogan they have about responsibility, integrity, support, and effort. And then things you had to do at all times in the learning environment and in the staff room. Actually, probably because so the red ones, because I imagine that putting this up as a PowerPoint slide and people wouldn't be able to read. So I'm just going to highlight the red ones. So if we can go to the next slide where I'm just showing you the red ones. And I just want to raise this so briefly, but this is what staff are being told at all times. Remember that the behavior you walk past is the behavior you accept, right? So if somebody says something and you don't pull them up, well, then you've agreed to that behavior. While you're out in the playground, make sure you're picking up litter, just like you expect the kids to do. Then, this is clearly, pre-social distancing time. Greet students as you walk through the grounds, smile, shake hands, give high fives. Don't wear hats inside the classroom, get to the students beat your students to the classroom. Keep students in for the required detention when they arrive late to class. To me, this is kind of the epitome of a deprofessionalizing, disrespectful way in which to treat staff. How many places how many, lawyers' chambers would you go into where they'd have a little matrix, matrix up on the side saying, make sure your tie's on straight. Don't forget to stand up when a client comes in the room. Like, that wouldn't happen. And this, to me, is kind of demeaning and disrespecting of our teaching profession. So we can take that slide off. It was just trying to illustrate the point that sometimes we don't always necessarily help ourselves, and that we have to be ever vigilant of such kinds of disrespect. So keeping teachers in the profession. Schaefer, Long and Clarendon make the point, and it's a nice point, I think, that it's not just about how do we keep people in the profession, but how do we sustain them in the profession so that they're excited about working in the profession? So as they say, that they feel fulfilled and seeing themselves make a strong contribution. Contribution is a key word, right? And so I think that this now comes to the workplace and issues of social justice in the workplace and of respecting teachers. So I can see the time now all of a sudden. This is my fear of putting too much in and suddenly running out of time. Social justice plays itself out in many ways in schools, around economics, around cultural injustice, political injustice, the ways in which people don't have access to voice in a school and decision making. But Paul Gomberg, in a lovely book, How to Make Opportunity Equal, Race and Contributive Justice, raises this notion, what he calls contributive justice, as a form, as something which clearly applies to the workplace. So when he's talking about contributive justice, it relates to what people are allowed to contribute, expected to contribute, or required to do or contribute. Now you think about this in the workplace. As a teacher, what can I contribute to the curriculum? If the curriculum is being, or we've got, setups that are almost like teacher-proof curricula, you are kind of not enabling teachers to contribute what they know and understand, especially early career teachers who've just come through, many of whom have just come through university and have understandings about curriculum. How do you get them to contribute? What are they allowed to contribute? Also, who gets to do, who always gets which particular classes? How do those shared out? For instance, who always gets the, and I hate saying this, but it's, having interviewed teachers and some male teachers who in the past who've left the profession because they always get given the naughty kids and they always get given the sport, and they hate sport, and they say, look, so many of the female teachers at the school could do it much better than I could. Why do they give me all the naughty kids? Because of a particular construction of masculinity. And so there are those issues of social justice entwined within this notion of contributive justice. They also, and Andrew Sayer, who's used Paul Gomberg's work a lot, makes this point: what we do in life has at least as much influence on who we become and the quality of our lives as does what we get. And if you think about it, so what we actually do, the daily kind of grind, our work, the amount of satisfaction we get from that impacts on the quality of our lives. Again, when I've interviewed teachers about how do you make your job better, nobody, and I'm sure nobody would mind extra pay, but that's very low down on the list. It's normally time to engage and to think and to reflect and to prepare and to do what teachers would like to do. And I think we have to think about, what does meaningful work for teachers mean? And that is about respect. And again, Gomberg draws on this notion of the separation of conception of a task and its execution, and that in incredibly hierarchical systems, we have something where somebody conceives the idea, then sets out, and other people have to execute that idea, and where they have no connection back to its conception. And that kind of, and that's, and its extreme manifestations, it's kind of the assembly line idea, where you're sitting on one point on the assembly line, continually doing something, having no idea where the part fits that you're putting together, and so on, in whatever machine. But in teaching, that's increasingly the conception and execution are being separated, and that work is only meaningful when those two things are pulled together. Getting very close to the end. So if we want to have a respected teacher's profession, and especially we want to have a teacher's profession that we can call, in Judith Sachs' terms, mature, we need to recognize both its intellectual labor and the emotional labor that's involved in teaching. And I think that too often is the intellectual labor involved in teaching is ignored. Okay, great. Oh, sorry, somebody just said something in my ear, telling me I had 5 minutes left. That's what I was saying. Great too. So one of the things that you see when you and I've forgotten who said it now, and I think it might have been Nick Gibbs, and I apologise to Nick Gibb if I've got it wrong. That he would rather just have kids taught by a graduate from Oxford with no teacher qualifications than someone who'd got a teacher education qualifications from a rubbish university. And to me, again, that kind of misses the point about the intellectual work that goes into teaching. And Nina Bassica and Andy Hargraves make a lovely point where they say, teachers help to create the generations of the future. Their work as such cannot and must not be reduced to skill and technique alone. Teaching that is worthy of the name is visionary work, imbued moral purpose that ultimately develops the citizens of tomorrow. Teaching is therefore profoundly intellectual in its underpinning purposes, as well as in its complexity. I think the emotional labor that goes into teaching, and again, I could go on at length about teachers, and I've had teachers crying in interviews with me about the kind of emotional nature of their work. And that often gets ignored, often gets, toughen up, but it's both and Isenbarger and Zimbalist talk about this difference between emotional labor and emotional work. So the emotional work is when you're helping people deal with their emotions and issues around that. Emotional labor is when you have to actually hide your emotions because of how you might feel at a particular point. And that part of the job is really significant. So I'm now into actually I had a slide. So there was a poll being done about COVID-19 and one of the reasons for that, and whether teachers are more or less respected or the same as a result of COVID-19. I'm not quite sure of the results of that poll, but when I was thinking about it, to me, it seemed, again, many of the headlines I was seeing about, there's a new respect for teachers' work, was kind of almost disrespect in a way, because it didn't take into account the kind of knowledges that teachers bring into constructing curriculum. It didn't take into account the ways in which teachers manage multiple identities within a classroom. And so it kind of simplified teachers' work, which ironically, in some ways, was disrespectful rather than respectful. That's the only point I'd make about that, and maybe other people might disagree with me. Okay, so so there's some results. Am I saying this, Kate? Yeah. Okay. So the Twitter poll is, the question was, in your opinion, how have school closures affected the level of respect for the complexity of teachers' work? 61 said more respect. 17 less respect. 22 no change. And so that's interesting. And I guess I would be interested in debating the 67%. But if there is greater respect for teachers, I couldn't be happier. So how do we move towards respected teachers? And so these are my concluding points now. I think meaningful work has to be seen as a social justice issue. We have to think, how do we bring teachers into the conversation around their work so that they are contributing to both the conception of the things they're expected to do in the class as well as the execution. It has to be about recognizing the nature of teachers' labor, intellectual and emotional, which gets away from those tick boxes kind of teacher standards, which don't in any way capture the intellectual and emotional labour of teachers. We think we have to acknowledge that schools are workplaces. They're not just places of learning for young people, they're also workplaces, and that workplace justice has to be at play in those workplaces. I think we have to build trust across the teaching profession with intelligent accountabilities, a respectful conversation around who teachers are accountable to and for what they're accountable. I think we have to create opportunities for teachers to contribute to all key decisions affecting them and their students. So in my work, and Sue mentioned it briefly about alternative schools, and I have looked to, it was part of work looking for young people who've been excluded from school, looking at what worked to keep them in education. And what started to find is, and so the purpose of that was to look for kind of things that made us think differently about how schools and classrooms were organized for these young people. But we started to find that teachers were actually really enjoying many of these workplaces more than mainstream schools. A paper I did with my partner, Glenda McGregor, in the British Journal of Sociology of Education on teaching in the margins, rekindling a passion for teaching, came out of that work. And there was one, and I'm just going to quote one teacher in my second last kind of point, who had been in this school, and this is what I would like to see in teachers and in early career teachers like this young woman, Hannah. She says, I was so exhausted that first year of teaching, and my brain was fried from the intellectual labour, and I had lots of frustrations, but driving home, I'd always feel the smile muscles had been active all day. So I'd go, yep, this is really it. There are those elements of frustration and exhaustion and self-doubt and all that kind of stuff. But I still felt that I was in a place that I really wanted to be in. And I think that teacher was an environment, and it was an alternative school, but it was an environment where the teachers and students both felt respected. And it was hard work, really hard work, but it actually paid off, and she was where she wanted to be. 2 minutes over, and two very short quotes. So back to where we started and the kind of notion of not being silent. And Richard Sennett makes in his point in his book, you cannot become truly aware of where you stand in the world without fighting the meanings others have imposed on you. I think we have to fight the meanings that have been imposed on teaching, and we have to fight for a mature profession. And I say this last point to everyone involved in education, and I draw on Graham Smith, a renowned Maori academic in New Zealand, who's talking about a particular Maori theory of education. But he says, don't just write and talk about it. Show me the blisters on your hands. We have to work hard to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. At this point, we would surely be applauding you, and I'm sorry we can't do that in any kind of way that you'll be able to hear, but many, many thanks for a really thought-provoking lecture, which is going to create many more questions and certainly reflection from all of us who've been on this call. As is customary for our professorial lectures, we will now hear a brief response from a colleague, and I'm delighted to introduce Ching Gu, our Professor of Leadership in Education here at the IOE. Ching's research focuses on teachers' work, their lives and effectiveness, as well as school improvement and systemic change in education. That work includes numerous prestigious studies of education reforms in the UK and internationally, and importantly, their impact on teachers. Ching's work on teacher resilience is particularly impactful. Ching, I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on what Martin has said. Please, can I now invite you to make your response?
Thank you, Sue. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to respond to and reflect on Martin's great lecture. I was deeply touched by his personal story on the tube at the outset of his talk. And there are so many great ideas. I was sitting here thinking I really agree with Martin very strongly and emotionally strongly about the meaningfulness of the profession. So the ways that Martin unpacked the notion of respect and teaching led to 5 reflections that I would like to share with you here. So the first reflection, what made me think is some deep questions around what keeps many teachers going in the profession. The notion of professional fulfillment came to mind, and the way that we phrase in our work and also in the literature that professional fulfillment should be seen as teachers' entitlement. And that relates very closely to what Martin talked about tonight. Teachers' labor is both emotional and also intellectual. So professional fulfillment, different from what's often being used in the literature about teachers' job satisfaction, we feel that it kind of really goes into the heart of the whole range of deep issues Martin has touched on in his lecture. One is the intellectual and emotional reward that many teachers derive from their students' success. I'm sure that many of us can think of many stories we've heard directly and indirectly from teachers themselves. And secondly, the ways in which teachers' capacities and capabilities have been developed that enable them to bring about such success and reward. And that is very important in terms of making teachers feel that teaching is not just a job, but is a profession that makes them feel deeply fulfilled. And the third dimension, which I've learned from Martin's lecture, is relating to teachers' professional fulfillment, is the students' appreciation. Many times he talked about we are less likely to see students who are resilient and committed to their own learning if their teachers are not. So the students' appreciation of teachers' hard work in their efforts, which we found, and as Martin talked about many times in his lecture, connects very deeply with the hearts and soul of many of the very people that teachers care about and care for in their work, and adds a kind of indispensable emotional dimension to their feelings of being fulfilled as a professional in teaching. The second reflection I've had is about retention. I like to quote my dear colleague and friend, John Donford's, it's got a subtitle in his leadership book called Retention First, Recruitment Second. We do recruit, there has been a lot of emphasis from the government trying to attract the right people, the great people into the profession. But actually, thinking of the statistics Martin has shared about teacher attrition within the first 3 years, we're highly likely as a profession losing about up to a third of the teachers. And the statistics showing in many countries, in Australia, England, and Australia, we could lose up to 50% of the teachers. So the concepts of retention first, recruitment second goes a long way. It kind of invites us to think there has been a lot of work talking about teachers' workload. And as Martin's final quote, a very touching quote, showed, and as we have spoken with, in many schools, teachers are not worried about hard-working life. What is really fundamentally important, workload cannot be and should not be simply interpreted in terms of the number of hours teachers work. Of course, that does matter. I don't want to emphasize that we expect our teachers to work 8 days a week, but when we speak to teachers about what really mattered to them in terms of the workload, and 3 things came up, and that's not the 3 M's was actually one of the DFE's workload recommendations. The first one is meaningfulness. The second one is motivational. Teachers will really have to feel that this workplace gave them the opportunities to learn and to feel motivated, and their students are motivated to learn. And the third one is manageable. Of course, there are certain hours and we can't expect our teachers to finally break. So that goes back to what Martin has emphasized again and again in his lecture about sustaining teachers' passion for learning and sustaining their desire to make a difference and continue to make a difference over the course of their professional lives. And that, for us, if I dare say, on behalf of Martin and me, profoundly defines the nature, the meaning of the teaching profession. And the other retention point I wanted to make is the retention first, recruitment second is the recent research evidence on teacher retention has been consistently reporting that teacher leavers are not necessarily escaping from pupil support behavior, as we often see from the government reports. I've been to the worst, the most deprived communities, and to visit what we call in our earlier work with Christine and Pam Salmons, oasis schools. In those kind of schools, despite children's backgrounds, we see collegiality between teachers. We see the many teachers telling us that they feel respected and feel valued in that work context. So I really liked what I have read in the last 5 years, and we wanted to test our hypothesis in England. Unfortunately, the research, the DFE pulled the plug. The evidence over the last 5 years from the USA is telling us, teachers are when we talk about retention, many teachers are escaping from poor leadership, and associated with that is dysfunctional school cultures where teachers teach behind closed doors. And so what it's telling us is the importance of the conditions and environments of teachers' workplaces, as Martin has also addressed very strongly in his lecture. The third reflection is talking about retention is not just the physical retention of teachers, keeping teachers physically in the profession, in the classrooms. It's actually it's what matters most is the heart and mind retention of teachers, which is related to what Christine and I have written in our work on the new lives of teachers. We say it's a quality retention of teachers that matters. We liked Susan Moore Johnson's work in Harvard on teacher retention, and their argument is the physical retention of teachers in and of itself is not a worthy goal. Instead, student learning is a goal, and schools must seek to return teachers who demonstrate that they are skilled and effective in the classroom and are committed to student learning. And this just, reminds me of what Martin said in the story in 2 minutes left in the tube. I won't elaborate a similar story, but it's about what really matters as schools. That links to my fourth reflection is sustaining teachers' passion for learning and teaching is more than an individual responsibility. There is a myth that teachers typically improve over the first 3 to 5 years and then they plateau. But the Sutton Trust report in 2014 shows very strong evidence, and also we can see in other research that teachers working in schools with more supportive professional environments continued to improve significantly after the 3 years, i.e. they do not plateau. And this leads us to Martin and I, we are working on an ESRC GCRF project called Schools as Enabling Places. And that's profoundly what we believe, that the schools that are well-led, filled with committed and highly passionate teachers, they are the places where teachers' professionalism, capability and well-being are nurtured, looked after, where teachers feel that they talk about not just only individual learning, but also more importantly, the concepts of organizational learning, the healthy individual and collective learning and achievement cultures in schools that enables teachers, to found their continuing professional learning and personal fulfillment more than job satisfaction through their work. Because this is important, the notion of organizational learning as compared to individual teachers' professional learning and development is far more important for retention, because it influences, as we know from research, how teachers feel about their work. I've got one more reflection and I will shut up. It's how they influence how teachers think about themselves as professionals. And finally, relating to what Martin talked about, the contribution enable them to continue to sustain their commitments to contribute to the learning of their students. My reflection 5 is about respect. Valuing and respecting teachers is a social, political, and societal responsibility. And just very briefly, I wanted to address what Martin said in his conclusion. Innovative education and pedagogy can't happen without respected teachers. And what really is meaningful in our conversations about teacher retention is a meaningfulness of the professionalism in their workplaces. Final remarks, 3 statements. Becoming a wonderful teacher or a great teacher is a lifetime affair. And that's Mayer's quote in 2010, one of my most favorite quotes to describe the lives of teachers. And second, getting the right people into the profession and importantly, developing them to become great teachers matters. Finally, the environments in which teaching and learning take place will continue to change. And if they're to sustain their capacities to teach to their best, teachers will have to learn to live new lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ching, for a brilliant response, and again, raising so many important questions. As we approach the end of tonight's event, I just want to make a couple of points myself, if I may. The poll said 61% thought that as a result of the pandemic, that there was more respect for teachers. So I leave you with this question. Can we capitalize on this moment then? The complexity of teachers' work with children and young people has become more visible, perhaps, and more widely known to the public. So perhaps there's some potential there. But probably the most powerful point for me was highlighted by Martin, and that is the lack of involvement of teachers in decision-making. And perhaps this is the space in which we might rebuild that respect. And I wonder, and I'm going to ponder on this, I think, a lot after tonight, how can we help that to happen? It seems absolutely key in this. So I guess that brings us to the end of proceedings. Unfortunately, we can't follow this with our usual drinks reception, which is always such a lovely occasion. But perhaps we can all charge our glasses at home and continue the discussion via social media. And I would really encourage all of you online today to participate in that. If we want to make meaningful change, let it start here. So thank you very much. We've got lots more events to come, so please do keep an eye on our website. We really want to engage with our community of teachers and more widely. So please do log on. And that just leaves me to say a very warm thank you to all of you, to Martin for his brilliant lecture, to Ching for her response. Have a very good evening and hope to see you soon.